Good morning.
Good morning.
So we used to do this thing before COVID, and then remember that? Remember COVID? and so we started to say our names again, which we didn't do for a while because of COVID and all the complexities. But there's another thing which totally escaped my mind until last week. That was I used to ask you to greet each other, and there was some real specific instructions. It's not time for a conversation. It's time to greet your neighbor. So if you please turn to your sides and just say good morning to the people next to you.
Good morning.
Fist bumps or bows. Great, thank you. I was remembering when I was a boy, I was raised in the Catholic Church, and my favorite part of Mass, absolutely, well, there's two favorite parts of Mass. And maybe it says something about my spiritual inclinations now. One was when, those of you who aren't Catholic, this may or may not make sense to you, but when the priest would raise the host right before communion. So there's a point where the host is what you receive, the body of Christ in communion. And in the Catholic Church, there are round discs that were made, at least the church that I went to, they were made by a group of nuns that had a retreat in Oregon somewhere, and they would make these. And we even had whole wheat ones. That was a big deal in the 70s. They switched to whole wheat. And they're about this big. But then the one that the priest uses is about this big, not whole wheat. Perfectly white. And there's a part in the Mass where they're preparing and blessing the host, and there's this point where the priest holds it up, and you're sitting there. If you're attending, there's the altar. There's the priest behind the altar. It's post-Vatican II, so the priest is facing you. Before that, the priest would have been facing the crucifix, which is behind them, and the body of Christ is there on the wall, and the whole thing, and the blood coming down, and then the altar boys down, and they go, dee. They have these bells, and it's really magic. Okay, I think it's especially magic I feel like I got just the right amount of Catholicism. I know some of you it was too much, and that might there's some triggering things there. But anyway, that was my first, one of my favorite. There was two, but the other one was that there was one point in the Mass, towards the end of the Mass, where the priest would say, "Turn to your neighbor," and you would turn to your neighbor and say, "Peace be with you." Yeah. And I don't know if other churches did that or not. And you would shake hands, and you would peace be with you. And so it was like the body of Christ right there in the circular presence of the embodiment of the people there in the church. And so it's with that spirit. That was a lot of explanation for such a short little thing. It's important that we care for each other in this way. Even you come together on a Sunday, maybe this is your first time, maybe you've been here tons of times, a spattering of times. It's important that the body of awakening is not simply an individual activity. There's no such thing as individual activity, but we imagine it to be so. And especially when we come to spiritual practice, it's right that we're concerned with our own individual lives. That's not the problem. The problem is that we cut ourselves off. And in the cutting of ourselves off, we think that the spiritual practice is about my own personal journey. And it's easy to forget that whatever journey we take is embedded within a body that is way beyond our capacity to grasp, right? And it shows up as our community, shows up as our family, shows up as our enemies, shows up as all kinds of different things. So it's important, that kind of greeting. Okay, that's not what I'm talking about this morning. So I want to talk about darkness. You may be aware that this Friday at 11:49 Greenwich Standard Time, I looked it up before this talk, will be the equinox. That means here it'll be a little before 4. I think it's like 3:59 in the afternoon. And the equinox means that day and night will be exactly the same length at that time. It's where the Earth's relationship to the sun is the equator's pointing exactly at the sun. And so we have that kind of equal quality of night and day, whatever that is, where you are, the time zone that you're in, it will hit a little bit different time. And traditionally within a Buddhist tradition, equinox is one of the times which is acknowledged, and I don't know if celebration is the right word, but there's a veneration that happens at that time, particularly veneration of the earth spirits. And when I say earth spirits, they're not just earth spirits, they're also sky spirits and all kinds of spirits of the material world. In this case, earth doesn't just mean like dirt. Earth means the material plane. And that material plane includes water and fire and wind and space and earth, the way that we normally think of it. And in that world of the material, there's something that's very, very important. The Buddha Dharma flows in that material world, and we're protected by it. And for our lives in the material plane, we need all kinds of connection, and there's things that we need to take care of. And so there was a period at Buddha Ai where we did some ceremonies surrounding that. It was for a couple years early on, and then as things got busy and this and that, we sort of let them drop away. And so we're going to revive that next week. So next Sunday there will be a special ceremony for the equinox that is this veneration of the earth spirits, and there will be a dedication of this icon, which is here to my left, which is this altar is to the earth spirits. And we'll talk more about that next week. So that's part of why I want to talk about the dark, because we're right at this shift, right? We're shifting into a darker time. There will be more darkness in the day than there will be light. And this connects with something that I was speaking about last week. For those of you who were here, I was giving this image of the wild persimmon, the wild orange persimmon, which is a fruit that grows in East Asia a lot. Not so much here. Most of the persimmons we have, I think, are planted, at least in Oregon. And people tend to plant the sweet persimmons for obvious reasons. You can pick them off the tree and peel them and eat them, and they're quite tasty. But the wild persimmon is very astringent. But the astringency changes to sweetness if you're patient and you stay with it. If you just let the persimmon be the astringent persimmon that it is, and maybe you hang it up someplace or let it stay on the tree, it gets very gooey and unbelievably sweet. Like kind of too sweet. Very, very, very sweet. And so the image that I was giving last week that was coming from this teaching by Menzan, who I'm giving some lectures on one of his texts on Thursday nights, is he says, don't remove the astringency from the persimmon. If you do that, you'll never come to know the sweetness. This is a teaching he gives. And he's talking about spiritual practice. When we try to strip the astringency from life, the difficulty, the pain, the nitty-gritty parts, when we try to strip that out, if we think spiritual practice is leaving that behind, or technology or practice to leave that behind, we don't ever get the sweetness. We actually need to stay present with that difficulty, with the places that are hard to reconcile. And if we do, then a depth emerges to practice, which isn't possible when we simply rely on the techniques to remove the pain. Now, those can be very important. Sometimes we need a break, right? And meditation, for example, if we learn to set ourselves upright and to pay attention to our breathing and let go of the reactivity to things outside and inside of ourselves, we can find a kind of spaciousness emerging that can be really sweet, right? And it is leaving behind the grind a little bit. And then you get done and you stand up and the grind's still there, right? So I'm not saying that that's a problem. It's just that when our fundamental orientation is based on that, we think that's the goal, we tend to start isolating ourselves from the reality of life, and then things go off the rails a bit. So it turns out, part of what it means to stay with this wild persimmon is to know the darkness. The darkness is very important. It's significant. It's meaningful. Just because you can't pick something out and point to it and say, this is what it is. Like in the dark, you can't do that, right? It's obscure. You can't see exactly what it is. But that makes it all the more meaningful, the things that you discover in the dark. They're not in the kind of sharp contrast of the way that we typically try to know things. There is an ambiguity. There's the urging, the invitation for a consistent attentiveness to this thing. Not simply, well, I know what it is now, let's get a game plan and take care of it, right? Which is so much the way that our mind tends to work. So staying connected with the wild person then, being willing and able to stay present with the deeper parts of our life that lay beyond difficulty, or they lay below the kind of difficulty we might be experiencing. This rich life of the dark allows us to do something that we can't when we're just shining our headlamp on it. As many of you have heard me complain about before, when you go camping, don't wear one of those things. Just don't. It's horrible. It's horrible for everyone around you. That's the first place to start. Everyone around you suffers when you wear one of those. And I will say, you suffer too, because you think that's what the world's like, right? And we'll get to that in a second here, because it turns out actually even without the headlamp, that's happening in your consciousness all the time. Just an external appendage that mirrors what vision is. Anyway, I went camping with my best friend a couple of weeks ago. I was down in Sonoma, and it turns out his family he lives in San Francisco, and he was going there to camp for a couple days, and where I was just like a 15-minute drive from where he was. We have that kind of relationship. We'll just call him up and be like, I'm going to come see you, and he'll be like, actually, I'm here. And then I'll be like, oh, well, actually, I'm going to be there too. And so we had a couple nights that was really great. But they all wore those headlamps. I didn't have the goal to tell them to take them off. That's all these little kids, you know. I did, though, give him this book, In Praise of Shadows, which I'll talk about here in a second. I said, read this, Jacob. So, let's talk about the symbolism of darkness in Buddhism. So within Buddhism, usually when we talk about darkness, it's symbolic. And there's a literal side to it, but the symbolic part takes precedence. And so the most common way that darkness is used as a symbol is a reference to ignorance. And that makes sense, right? When you're in the dark, right? You're ignorant of something. So in Buddhism, ignorance refers to the inability to see or to know or to believe that all things are interrelated, that all things rely on each other. The kind of ignorance of isolation, that's a primary understanding. We could also say ignorance of the law or ignorance of the deep fundamental truths that the Buddha awoke to, which we all are in the dark there, okay, to a certain degree. Right, so that's one way that darkness gets used as a symbol for ignorance. But it also, this is very interesting, it also gets used as a symbol for the undifferentiated, for the oneness of things. And so if you think about that, when you take away the dark, you can't make distinctions between things so clearly, right? So it's the symbol for wholeness, or the symbol for oneness. And so in that sense, it has kind of a positive spin, and in the other sense has a kind of negative spin. And I love this. Part of it is just like, well, of course, things symbolize different things, and it's nothing you can do about that, and sometimes they conflict with each other. But I also think there's a way in which those two are related, and it's interesting to think about that. How darkness could both be pointing to something which is really valued within a Buddhist practice, which is coming to know the wholeness of things, or coming to know the undifferentiated, or coming to know that things are not really separate, like the way they appear in the visual world, very distinct. Right? That's not like that. That's the wisdom side. But also, not being able to pick something out and recognize its truth as a thing is also lack of wisdom, is also kind of ignorance. So the issue here is not so much about it being light or being dark or being able to see or not being able to see. It's about the wholeness of light, or the wholeness of light and darkness, which are just part of the same thing. Light and shadow are one. They always come together. And that's celebrated in our tradition. So if we want to think about darkness and the way darkness might play a role in our practice, which I'll get to that, don't worry, is I think it's more helpful to think about not splitting light and dark apart. And that's one of the reasons the equinox is so important. This is the place where light and dark come into this balance. And as we turn to the dark, there's opportunity to cleave something apart. Like maybe you don't like the winter, which I grew up in Oregon and I just sort of love Oregon winters, but I know for a lot of people that's not the case. You know, it's kind of depressing. Right? And so you might be like, oh no, the sun's going away, the light's going away, the darkness, no. And there's this kind of, this kind of shift that happens. Our practice, one of the things it helps us do is keep these two together, keep them connected, not separate them and put them at odds with each other, but allow them to be one whole. Because when light is split from darkness, it becomes ignorance. It becomes active ignorance. It becomes the inflicting of what I see and believe to be true on the world. Right? I can pick things out, right? But I pick them out according to my own karma. And I say, that's the way it is. And I have no room for the ambiguity or the places where I don't know or things can't be perceived. So that's one way that ignorance shows up. When darkness is split from light, it becomes passive ignorance. When you say, oh, I don't know, and you just recede into a kind of narrow, trying to figure out, how do I feel? Is it okay? Is it not okay? And my world gets smaller, I get more isolated. Right? So this is the afflictions of them splitting apart. So some things to notice in this exploration of darkness or bringing darkness into practice. If we shift from darkness as a symbol within Buddhism and think about darkness, the role that darkness plays in attention or in perception, or I would just say in life. What you call life, what I call life, not just you, is like all these perceptions. It's all of these instances of experience, right, which are flashing either from internal places or what I think of as exterior places or a combination of the two. There's this thing that's rolling along, which is like it's kind of like a movie, but a very cool 3D, like surround sound and all certain ways kind of movie. And so in that life, it's important for us to notice that we have this habit. We have the habit of trying to ignore what we don't know, or ignore what we can't see, or here I would say ignore what's in the darkness, and invest all our energy in what can be seen and the creation of a world based on what we can know. I would call this the kind of false rending of the darkness. So we, in the dark, we're afraid. We want to know, and so we rip it in two with our forward motion to know and to grasp and to understand. Now this happens at the very basic level of experience. So maybe some of you have studied this before, and when you explain it, it doesn't come into such focus, but I'd encourage you, if this stuff is kind of interesting to you, there's lots of stuff on the internet now. OPB did a special on visual perception and all this kind of illusions that happen through visual perception, etc. Really fun to watch that stuff. It can kind of prime you for saying, oh wow, maybe things are not as clear as I think they are. Or even when you've admitted things aren't as clear as you think they are, you still walk around thinking they're clear, right? Even you could admit intellectually they're not clear, but when it comes down to like, okay, what do I got to do today? How am I going to get things done? I guarantee you think it's pretty clear, right? You don't walk out in front of the bus, which is pretty clear. Don't do that, okay? But so getting these things in yourself and helping to realize what your habit is. I was watching a show the other day that's put on by OP. It was on OPB. So it's Nova. I think you had mentioned it, Jacqueline, that where they did some of this stuff. And I had worked with these illusions a lot when I used to teach school. But there was one that they did that I hadn't seen before, and it was super cool. So it's kind of an illusion. They have the technology now that they can put a camera on your eyes, and then they can tell exactly where you're looking by your eye movements. And so they have a screen, right? And you're looking at the screen, and the computer's keeping track of exactly where you're looking on the screen. Okay, pretty trippy, right? Okay. So the illusion is they put a picture on the screen, some kind of a I think in this case it was like a view of like a cityscape. And then they put in exact focus the very small visual field which you actually see in detail, which is about that big. And that part is perfectly clear on the screen. Everything else is blurry. Is that you following me there? Mm-hmm. So the person who's in the experiment and looking, it looks like the screen's all clear. It looks just like the cityscape in high definition. Mm-hmm. But anybody who's not and who's looking at it, what do they see? They see a circle of clarity bouncing around the screen because the person's eyes are doing this to pull in the information and then make assumptions about what goes in between the different spots that you see with your eyes. Okay? So this is happening all the time. You're experiencing it in this moment. This room seems like it's awash in high definition. But actually, from a mechanical standpoint, what's happening is your eyes are taking in little shrouds of information and filling in all the places that you're not looking at directly and making the experience of a room a high definition room. Headlamp. You don't need the one here. Just the headlamp of your consciousness is doing this for you very naturally. And I don't mean to say that that is a problem. That's actually great. That allows us to experience this world. The reason I'm bringing it up is because in that environment, we're putting a lot of energy into the fabrication of this moment, fabrication of experience, fabrication of reality. What has a chance to get in outside of what you've constructed in that moment? This is the conundrum of light and dark. That functioning of seeing is all the working of the light. What's the participation of the dark? What's the significance of it? This built world that we rely on so wholly. There's a really old image in Buddhism to describe ignorance. And it's kind of the words sound funny in English, but it means plank seeing. Plank seeing means you have a plank, like if you had a big plank and you held it on the like one side to carry it, and you can only see half the world. And so it's saying that that's what we're doing all the time. We're splitting the world into two, and we're just paying attention to one side of it, and that's ignorance. That's how we create a problem, because we just take one side over the other all the time. And this imbalances our living. If you think about it, there's a plank all the time. You don't got to pick up a piece of wood to experience this plank vision, because you don't have eyes in the back of your head. At least I don't think most of you do, right? There's a sea of darkness right here, continually, even with your eyes totally open. But we're almost completely unaware of it. What I mean by unaware of it isn't that we could look at it, because you look at it and it's not that anymore, right? Now it's over here. You can't look at it, right? That's why it's darkness. Right? Because it can't be looked at. We're talking not just about like a fabrication or not fabrication. We're talking about the inability to see. Right? Now we could put a mirror up, and try to look behind us, but then it disappears too. So what about that? What about the part that we can't see, the part that we can't know, the part that just by the fact of turning towards something emerges? If I look at June, there's a whole world I can't see because I'm looking at her. Dogen Zenji, when he describes what is the function of Zazen. What is meditation? He uses this ancient phrase that didn't start with him. It's to take the backward step that turns the light and shines it back. The backward step that turns the light and shines it back. Mostly people misunderstand this statement and they mistranslate it, and they say the backward step that turns the light and shines it inward. Okay? Now that's not, it has its place, especially for a society and a culture in which we're almost wholly turned outward. We invest in the exterior illumination of things. Just go to the store if you want to experience this, with all the lights and the dazzling and the things that blink at you. Well, actually, you don't have to go to the store. Just open your phone. You know, we're beaming light into our eyes constantly to a world of objects. Like, we're so mired in that. So this phrase, in that sense, to say to take the backward step that turns the light and shines it inward, okay, it's pretty good. Inward versus this constant process of outward. But inward becomes a problem because if we just shine the light inward, we just look inside, well, then where's the darkness? The darkness is still there. There's something you can't see. But you're not admitting something. You're still trying to claim this darkness with knowledge. Claim the darkness with light rather than allow the light. So the wholeness of the light and the dark requires something different of us. It requires us to allow, not just to penetrate with our vision, not just to practice to get over our problems, not just to practice to be able to see what the issue is, but to practice with a receptivity. And the receptivity is the darkness. To not know something is the first time you have a chance to actually pay attention, to actually meet something like the flickering of something in the dark. You know, not shining your flashlight on it, but like a little turn, a little bending of light in the dark, and you see it. Last week someone asked me about overcoming isolation. You know, what is a practice for overcoming isolation? And I said to them, Zazen. And this is what I meant. When we're trying to illuminate all the connections, when we're trying to say, okay, I know we're interdependent, so let me go pick them all out. And I'm trying to really be aware of them. I'm trying to see them. There's something we can't do. In Zazen, we let go of that illumination as being the only thing that's there, and we allow for the darkness. That's a different kind of attention than shining your light on something. When we do that, it's not about looking for all the ways that I'm interconnected or celebrating the brief feelings that I have of oneness while you're sitting. You know, you get to that point. I mean, I hope you do sometimes, where you get to that point, you're like, whoa. You hear, like, this is the best thing. You know, like, you hear a bird outside and they go, wah! And then you can't tell if it's outside or inside. It's kind of like, it's so precious. It's wonderful. But the arising of that depends on darkness. Not like, okay, I'm going to listen for the birds. I'm going to listen for the birds. I'm going to listen for the birds. If you do that, it won't happen. You won't actually see the glint of gold in the darkness. You'll just hear the birds. And then you'll have this kind of tight reaction to your inseparability. Right? Actually, the bird's just a bird. And you're just you. Right? You got to allow that. And then the bird's right here. So, being embraced by darkness, or we could say relying on darkness, or recognizing the embrace of darkness, recognizing that most things we don't know. Most things we don't see, we don't hear. They're not part of this fabricated world. The fabricated world I have is held in this deep embrace of the unknown. That's what we do when we sit down. That's the roundness of this posture. It's not to know. It's to let go of forcing our self-view on experience. And it's to stop turning inward and shutting down to the receptivity of all of the things that may emerge, either from an outer world or from a deep interior world. I want to read you something from this book real short, and then I'll wind up and we can have some questions. This is a book called In Praise of Shadows. Has anyone read this? Just curious. I was sure that Myoan had read this. This is a book that was written in the 30s in Japan, where Japan's industrialized and becoming more modern. And he's a literary author who wrote it, but it's mostly about aesthetics and architecture. But if you read it with a different kind of mind, you see that it's not just about architecture and aesthetics, or maybe a better thing to say was architecture and aesthetics have everything to do with spirituality. Okay? So he's talking about gold. He's talking about how important gold is. Here we go. In such a dark place, gold draws so much light to itself is a mystery to me. But I see why in ancient times statues of the Buddha were gilt with gold, and why gold leaf covered the walls of the homes of the nobility. Modern man in his well-lit house knows nothing of the beauty of gold. But those who lived in the dark houses of the past were not merely captivated by its beauty. They also knew its practical value. For gold in these dim rooms must have served the function of reflector. Their use of gold leaf and gold dust was not mere extravagance. Its reflective properties were put to use as a source of illumination. Silver and other metals quickly lose their gloss, but gold retains its brilliance indefinitely to light the darkness of the room. This is why gold was held in such incredibly high esteem. I have said that lacquerware decorated in gold was made to be seen in the dark, and for the same reason were the fabrics of the past, so lavishly woven of threads of silver and gold. The priest's surplice, or like kesa, of gold brocade is perhaps the best example. In most of our city temples, catering to the masses as they do, the main hall will be brightly lit, and these garments of gold will seem merely gaudy. No matter how venerable a man the priest may be, his robes will convey no sense of his dignity. But when you attend a service at an old temple, conducted after the ancient ritual, you see how perfectly the gold harmonizes with the wrinkled skin of the old priest and the flickering light of the altar lamps, and how much it contributes to the solemnity of the occasion. As with lacquerware, the bold patterns remain for the most part hidden in the darkness. Only occasionally does a bit of gold or silver gleam forth. And he goes on and on like this for, 80 pages. The reason I'm reading that is, okay, there is a practical, how do we live? I would encourage you, turn lights off. Just try it. Like when you're around your house, just try, what would it be like to just like have a candle or like one light on? And just experience that a little bit. If you're lucky enough to live in a house that's been well designed around shadow, then you may have some areas that are rich with darkness, which you can appreciate and you can find refuge there. Most of us aren't that lucky. But do that in a really practical sense. Walk out into the dark in a place that you feel safe. I'm not asking you to go walk in a dark alleyway, although if you want to, if that seems right. But like walk out in your backyard, right, at nighttime when the moon is dark. Look at the darkness. It has its own texture. It has its own quality. And all of that is a kind of embrace, which is the opportunity for the flicker of some gold. There is a treasure there. There is a brocade robe, which is on the body of the Buddha in that darkness. And that's what I'm suggesting is integral to our practice. And the cycles that our material world affords us or offers us is an invitation to this exploration. Of course the summer's fun. Of course, bright light all day long and jumping into crystal clear water where you can see the bottom is like about as good as it gets. Right? But as the turn happens, there's this other kind of seeing that is possible. And just like there are these steelhead at the bottom of that deep, clear river, there are these dragons or catfish, perhaps, in the murky pond of your own being, in the mansion of the temple of your being. There's all these inner rooms, which can only be accessed through the dark. Questions of the hike?
I feel some trepidation about finding wording for this question because I think a lot of it reflects my culturally inherited allegiance.
Don't equivocate.
Don't equivocate.
Just ask.
Okay. There's a line, a blurriness of the line that I in my sort of like practical day-to-day life of grappling with this question, that I bump up against all the time. Which is in that place where you are in the darkness and recognizing that glint of gold is present. And there are moments where we are asked to say something about it. How does that happen?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yes, directly. And to speak without giving up the dark. So, like, you can speak assuredly about your vision of the gold, but when you realize that it has emerged from the darkness, you're probably not going to construct. You're not constructing a whole fabricated world which you cling to, and then as it changes, you get ticked off or disappointed or whatever. It's just simply what it is. That the gold scale in the darkness is like, wow. And then you can just speak about it directly. And that's speaking about it directly is different than needing to then be able to explain it. And this is where our, unrelenting training from a young age to write a 5-paragraph essay really does us disservice. We're never really invited to write poetry. We don't really take that very seriously. I get it too. I tried to get my high school students to like poetry. It was super hard. But we're not really cultured in that. We're cultured in the what can be seen. That's much easier. So speak about it with the heart of the poet. Because the poet realizes anything that's said is a billion things unsaid. And that's where a different kind of expression can happen. And no need to be right. You're so not caught up on that anyway, so I don't think that's your struggle. I meant that as a compliment. Yeah.
I'm hung up on the need to be right. That's a bad thing. He tells me that all the time.
Yeah.
There's so much in there that speaks to kind of this question that I've been sitting with is, when we have a lot of focus on like holding space with the dark in our own lives and for other people.
Yeah.
And trying to, it's so hard to keep both the spaciousness that there's just that's that oneness, there's room for it, it comes through, and not lose the individuality of the person. And then if you're like, don't lose the individuality of the person, then immediately you're limiting them to the darkness, right? You have to come back to the wholeness, and that image of ignorance as that plank vision, right?
Mhm.
Our inability to see one thing, and what it just keeps coming up to me is that practice enlightenment and keeping the question alive, right? That
Yeah.
I can't hold all those things at the same time, and that the art is to just keep
Yeah. Yeah.
moving
Yeah.
and noticing where I'm stuck from second to second.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah. Because you can't hold spaciousness.
right.
That's why it's spaciousness. You can't. I mean, I get that phrase, to hold space for, and I get it. Sometimes you just like hold a lot of stuff at bay, and don't be reactive because you want to allow. And so I think the term really serves a purpose, and it is a good term, and I'm glad it's in our lexicon because it didn't used to be. And at the same time, it's its own like hilarious joke. Hold space. You can't do that, right? That's why it's space. It's ungraspable. It can't be held. And so if you want to allow for the spaciousness to be what's emergent or relied upon in the situation, it's not about holding something, because once you hold the space, now that's in contradistinction to the individual. The wholeness and the individual become isolated from each other. It either has to be the whole or it has to be the individual. But we know that's not true. Actually, when things are spacious, we can be totally present with what's here, and particularly another person. And so it's like, when you sit down for Zazen, that's like a feeling. Just shake off the hold. Like you've got this grip on, not just on individual things that you desire, but you have a grip on your vision of life. That screen that the person looks at, where the thing's going all around, that image of what life is, we're all kind of carrying that screen around like this all the time. And so when you sit down, shake it off, right? And let the edges just, and in that place, what's behind you becomes really important. Right? Like you can feel. This is another thing to do in Zazen. When you're sitting, notice how if you pay attention to the plank of your being, in which you can see this direction, and even though you're not looking when you're in Zazen, your eyes are open and they're a little bit, so this is one of the reasons it's important to keep your eyes open and not close them, is so that this whole field of vision is here, all of the light is present, it's like the white side of the yin-yang symbol, and then everything in back of you is dark, and you can't pick out anything even if you want to, and you let this vision go soft. Let it drink in all the light. But it's the darkness that is drinking in the light. Your pupils are black. And they're receiving. And this blackness is like open. And it's totally willing to receive all of the light that's there. That's spaciousness. And then anything which is, boom, either appears in our physical visual field, or appears in the field of our mental world, or emotional world, or spiritual world of vision that isn't connected to the exterior world. It can live as it is, as an individual, because we're not trying to put it in relationship to the whole. Yeah. So there's a yoga of that, really, in meditation. It's very direct. There's also like, I'll encourage you. So on weekday mornings, we sit from 5 o'clock. You can come at 5 o'clock, or you could come at 6 o'clock for sitting. And if you come, what you'll find is there's a little bit of light on the Engawa here. And then there's one candle by Manjushri. And then it's dark. And then there's a candle in the front room. Something about sitting in that darkness. You can do that at your place too. But if you have some morning, if you kind of feel chipper, or at least resigned to getting up, come and just. I'm not saying that's the best place to practice or always, but to experience it sometimes. What it's like to just be in a dark place, sitting. It has a kind of it has a teaching of its own. And then at nighttime, as we get past the equinox and the days shorten, the nighttime sittings are the same way. It's dark and there's just one candle lit, and you have a different different kind of experience
I have a question.
there. Mm-hmm.
So when I think about darkness, one of the things that I immediately comes to mind is that darkness invites hallucination,
Mhm.
and that oftentimes those hallucinations are kind of like a manifestation of our anxieties or our fears,
Yeah.
and they can become overwhelming,
Yeah.
and they can feel real.
Yeah.
And I think there's, you know, some value in reflecting on that and like paying attention to those things, but also it can kind of spiral out of control.
Yeah.
And so, like, when do you think it is important to sit with those feelings, or you know, shine the light on
Yeah.
that space and bring it back to the real world?
Yeah, yeah. So this is one of the great powers of the darkness, is to open the gates of imagination. And imagination is an incredibly powerful thing. And I would say it's not unreal. It's not that this world's real and the imagination has unreal worlds. They're connected, but they're kind of also different realms. One thing that happens because we are not very attuned to the realm of imagination, particularly as it shows up in the dark. Most of our imagination comes through light, like movies being beamed into our brains and things like that, which I watch movies, I like movies, but that's kind of what we're mostly transfixed by, and those leave images in our being, and then our imagination, when it's to work on its own, there's a kind of like a poverty of how to work with the imagination that in modern life most of us live in. And so I think there's kind of two sides. One is we have to know our own karma. So when we feel like we're being overwhelmed, the darkness is calling out those kind of things that are overwhelming to us, turning our light to this world, so to speak, and using it as a grounding is really helpful and important. And you got to kind of play with that to see what the balance is. But when if you're feeling afraid and you feel like an increasing kind of like, yeah, just apply that. Bring your attention back, like to your breath, for example, and feel the breath coming in out in a very physical way, right? You can let your visual field rest on something and then say, okay, this floor, and just bring your awareness back there, right? And if you practice that, you can gain a kind of more a confidence to encounter things in the darkness that come through the imaginative part of our being. And as we gain more faculty there, I'd say this is maybe the most important reason for the darkness, is it reveals the imagination's participation in what we call life. That's ongoing all the time, and it's our own freedom that we have that capacity. It's like the freedom of our heart to be able to see imaginatively. So when we spend more time there and that faculty emerges more clearly, then we can rely on it. So we might also just lean into that, like if there's anything artistic or creative that you like to do that engages the imagination, that's another way. Make sure to have that like really engage it and come back to it again and again and again and again, because then your mind has a place to go in that realm, not only to the kind of emergence of our own anxieties, etc., into visions and that kind of realm. And then now and again, a good old-fashioned fantasy is helpful. I was fantasizing about building a deck this week, which I started doing yesterday. It got really annoying because I couldn't stop. I thought, I'm kind of bored. I'm just going to think about building the deck. And then like a couple minutes in, then I was like, oh my God, I can't. This is my big problem. I can't stop seeing the way all the pieces fit together. And then I have to do something else.